She stood up at my wedding reception and told 120 people that she was my real mother. She had a champagne flute in her hand. She had a dress that cost more than my first car. She had a smile, the kind of smile that you practice in a mirror until it looks natural, and she had absolutely no idea. No idea that the man seated at table 1, in the navy blue suit, with a leather portfolio folded under his arm. She had walked right past him during the cocktail hour, had probably smiled at him. No idea that he had been watching her since the moment the ceremony began. No idea what was about to happen to her in front of every single person she had spent 15 years trying to impress. I want to be honest with you before I tell this story. I am not the kind of person who is naturally strategic. I do not think 3 steps ahead. I am not, by nature, patient. But when someone spends 15 years trying to erase your mother, you learn. My name is Lauren Calloway. I grew up in Raleigh, North Carolina. And before anything else, before the drama, before the lawyers, before the wedding, you need to understand who my mother is. Who she actually is. Her name is Diane. Diane Calloway. She was a pediatric nurse for 22 years. She had brown hair that she always wore in this loose braid over her left shoulder. She smelled like lavender soap, and on Sunday mornings, like the vanilla extract she put in her pancake batter. And she laughed. God, she laughed with her entire body. Like laughing was a sport she had been training for her whole life. She was also, for a period of time, very sick. I was 8 years old when the first episode happened. She called it an episode, which I realize now was her way of protecting me from a word that felt too large for an 8-year-old to hold. The real word was breakdown. Acute psychiatric crisis, the doctor said. She was hospitalized for 6 weeks at the UNC Medical Center's psychiatric unit in Chapel Hill. I did not fully understand what was happening. I understood that my mother was somewhere I could not go. I understood that my father, my dad, Robert Calloway, was driving 40 minutes to Chapel Hill 3 times a week, and coming home red-eyed and quiet. I understood that the neighbors were bringing casseroles, and I understood that the woman who showed up at our house 2 weeks into my mother's hospitalization, the one my father introduced as a friend from work, who was just helping out for a little while, did not feel like a friend. Her name was Patricia. Patricia Holt. She was 34 years old. She had blonde hair, always blown out. She wore blazers to barbecues. She spoke in this smooth, deliberate way, like every sentence she said had been pre-approved by a committee. She brought me coloring books. She brought my dad coffee in a travel mug, already made, every morning. She was helpful in the way that a contractor is helpful, efficient, available, and already planning the renovation before you have agreed to the project. I should tell you something. This is the part I am least proud of. I liked her. At first. I was 8, and I was scared, and my mother was gone, and Patricia was there, and sometimes when you are a child, presence is enough. I let her braid my hair one afternoon. I sat in the kitchen while she made grilled cheese, and I told her about my 3rd-grade teacher, and she listened. Really listened. In that attentive, tilted head way that children find completely intoxicating. That memory has sat in my chest like a stone for a long time. My mother came home after 6 weeks. I remember the specific details of that afternoon, with a clarity that I do not have for most of my childhood. The smell of the car, my dad's old Jeep Cherokee, that faint mix of French fries and pine air freshener, the way the October light was doing something particular to the front yard. The way my mother walked through the front door and crouched down to my level and held my face in both of her hands. She said, "I am right here. I am not going anywhere." And she meant it. She absolutely meant it, in that moment. But the damage, the kind of damage that does not announce itself, had already begun. My father had not ended things with Patricia. I do not know exactly when it started. I was 8, and children operate on the information they are given. And the information I was given was, Patricia is a friend. Patricia is helpful. Patricia has been so kind. During a hard time. I did not have the vocabulary for what I was watching. I just knew that Patricia kept showing up, that she was at our house for dinner twice a week. that she and my father had conversations in the kitchen that stopped when I walked in. My mother knew. Of course she knew, but my mother was navigating something extraordinarily difficult. A return to a home that had quietly shifted in her absence. A husband who had emotionally relocated. And a disease that required her to manage her own stability before she could manage anything else. She held on for 2 years. I think about that a lot. 2 years of trying to hold a marriage together that one person had already decided to leave. 2 years of being the mother at the school pickup, and the wife at the dinner table, and the patient at the outpatient clinic, all at the same time. When I was 10, my parents separated. When I was 11, my father filed for divorce. When I was 12, he married Patricia. Here's the thing about Patricia that took me years to fully understand. She was not chaotic. She was not dramatic. She did not scream or scheme or make scenes. She operated with the quiet, methodical patience of someone who had already calculated the outcome and was simply managing the timeline. She was strategic in the way that cold weather is strategic. It does not announce itself. It just gradually makes the environment uninhabitable for everything that was there before. And what was there before was my mother. After the wedding, Patricia moved into our house in the Stonehaven neighborhood of Raleigh. She repainted the living room within 3 weeks, the blue-gray that my mother had chosen, the color I had grown up with, the color that had been the backdrop of every Christmas morning and every sick day on the couch, was replaced with what Patricia called warm grage. I remember standing in the doorway of the living room after school one day and just stopping. Like the room had become a stranger. My mother, by this point, had her own apartment in Cary, about 12 miles away. She had her outpatient program. She had her nurse practitioner and her therapist and her medication that was working, finally, really working. She was stable. She was building, but in the custody arrangement, I spent the school week with my father and Patricia, and weekends with my mom. And during those school weeks, 5 days out of every 7, Patricia was the one packing my lunches. Patricia was the one signing my permission slips. Patricia was the one who showed up at the parent-teacher conferences. And slowly, without any single dramatic moment, the narrative began to shift. Patricia started referring to herself as mom in front of my friends. The first time it happened, I was 13. We were at a soccer game, and one of my teammates asked who had brought the orange slices. Patricia said, "I did. Mom duty." She said it so easily, so naturally, like it was just a fact of the world. I said nothing. I was 13, and I was standing in a group of girls I wanted to like me, and the path of least resistance was silence. I hate that about myself. I chose the path of least resistance so many times in those years. The language escalated gradually. By the time I was 15, Patricia was introducing herself as my mother to new neighbors, to the parents of new friends, to the women in her book club. My actual mother, Diane, who drove from Cary every Saturday morning to take me to breakfast, who remembered every detail of every conversation we had ever had, who had fought through something enormous to stay in my life, was increasingly referred to by Patricia as the situation. As in, given the situation with Lauren's biological mother. Biological. That word. Like my mother was a technical detail. A footnote. And here is my enabling flaw, the thing I am most honest about when I look back at those years. I was lonely for belonging. I wanted a normal family structure, more than I wanted to fight for the accurate one. I was a teenager in a house with a father who had chosen Patricia, and choosing to love Patricia felt like the easier path to being loved back. So I let it happen. Not all of it, not without internal resistance, but enough. I let Patricia come to my high school graduation dinner. I let her be in the photos. I smiled when she held my arm and people assumed the obvious thing. And every single time I did that, I saw something flicker in my mother's eyes during our Saturday breakfasts. She never said anything. She would never have weaponized her hurt against me. But I saw it, and I carried it. If you have ever watched someone you love get quietly pushed out of a story that belonged to them, you know exactly what this feels like. It does not happen all at once. That is the thing people never understand. It happens so slowly that you almost miss it. If this is hitting close to home for you, I think you might want to stay for what happens next, because it does not end here. Not even close. I left for college at 18. University of North Carolina at Greensboro, and when I left, when I put the physical distance between myself and that grage-painted living room, something started to unspool inside me. I started therapy my second semester. Not because anything dramatic had happened, but because I sat across from my dorm roommate one night while she was talking about her mom. Just casually, the way people talk. About their parents, when their parents are not a complicated subject, and I started crying in a way I could not explain and could not stop. The kind of crying that is not about the present moment, the kind that has been waiting. My therapist's name was Dr. Anita Reyes. She had a small office in the student health building with a rubber plant in the corner that was either dying or thriving. I could never tell which. She was patient in the way that good therapists are patient, not rushingly kind, but genuinely curious. And over the course of about a year, she helped me start to name what had happened in my childhood, the reframing of my mother as unstable and unreliable, done through repeated small comments over years. Never one large statement, always plausible deniability. The language that positioned Patricia as the functional parent and my mother as the impaired one. The way my father had deferred to Patricia on every decision related to me, so that Patricia's preferences became the default and my mother's preferences became the exception. That required justification. None of it was technically illegal. None of it was dramatic enough to document. It was a sustained, deliberate erosion. And while I was in therapy, something else was happening. My mother was getting stronger. Diane Calloway had spent the years since the divorce doing something quiet and determined. She had rebuilt. She had completed an advanced certification in pediatric oncology nursing. She had moved to a better apartment in Cary, then bought a small house in Apex. She had a garden. She had friends. She had a life that was full and real and earned. And she had been doing regular check-ins with a family law attorney. Not because there was anything immediately actionable. I was an adult. The custody arrangement was long dissolved. But because my mother is a woman who does not leave loose ends. Because she had watched Patricia's behavior for years, and she had quietly, carefully, begun to document. I did not know this yet. Not the full picture. That would come later. I met Daniel Marsh at a work conference in Charlotte when I was 26. He was presenting on sustainable supply chain logistics, and I was there for a completely different panel, and we ended up at the same corner of the same hotel bar, at the same moment of mutual exhaustion, and that was it. We were engaged 14 months later. I want to tell you about Daniel, because he matters to this story more than just as the groom. Daniel is from a family that does not do complicated. His parents, Jim and Carol Marsh, out of Charlotte, have been married for 31 years. They have Sunday dinners, they call each other on birth. The Marsh family is not dramatic, and that normalcy was something I found both deeply appealing and, at first, slightly disorienting, like moving from a house with faulty wiring into one where all the lights just work. When I introduced Daniel to my mother, to Diane, he came home and said, "She is incredible. I see where you get it from." And I cried in the car. I cried because no one had ever said that to me in that particular way. No one had ever looked at my mother and seen the source of something good in me. The engagement announcement is when Patricia began to accelerate. She called my father immediately after I posted on social media, which, fine, is a normal thing. But within 48 hours, Patricia had emailed me a list of her ideas for the wedding. Venue suggestions, a florist she had a relationship with, a color palette, a table arrangement concept that she described as elegant but personal. She also sent me a separate note, handwritten, on her monogrammed stationery. I still have it. It said, "Lauren, I hope you know that this is the moment I have been waiting for since the day I came into your life. To be by your side as you begin this chapter, as your mother, is everything to me. All my love. Mom." She signed it Mom. I read that note 4 times. And then I sat with the feeling of it, that specific feeling of someone claiming a title that does not belong to them, with such casual, such absolute certainty that it almost makes you doubt your own understanding of the facts. I called my mother that night. Diane answered on the second ring, the way she always does. I told her about the note. There was a pause on the line, not an upset pause, not a wounded one, a calculating one. And then she said something that, at the time, I did not fully understand. She said, "Sweetheart, I need you to trust me for the next 6 months. Can you do that?" I said yes. I did not know yet what I was agreeing to. Daniel and I set the date for the last Saturday of September, 14 months away. The venue was a restored farmhouse property outside of Pittsboro, North Carolina. Wide wooden beams, a field that went gold in the fall light, a barn that had been converted into a reception hall with string lights and long communal tables. It was exactly what I wanted. Nothing theatrical, nothing that required a seating chart that felt like geopolitical negotiation. That last part did not work out. The first tension arrived about 3 weeks after Daniel and I booked the venue. Patricia called, not texted, called, to let me know that she had already reached out to the florist she had mentioned in her email. She had described the venue to them, given them the date, and had set up a preliminary consultation on my behalf. She was very excited to tell me this. She used the phrase, "I just wanted to get ahead of it for you" 4 times in a single phone call. I had not asked her to do this. I explained, as calmly as I could manage, that I already had a florist I wanted to contact, a woman named Rosa, who did work I had followed on Instagram for 2 years. Patricia paused in a way that communicated a great deal without saying anything at all. Then she said, "Of course, sweetheart. I just thought, given everything your mother is dealing with, you might want someone stable in your corner for the logistics." There it was. Given everything your mother is dealing with. My mother, who at this point had been stable and functional in building her life for over a decade. My mother, who had a house and a career and a garden and friends and a therapist she saw every other week as routine maintenance, not crisis management. My mother, who had done the hard, unglamorous work of recovery so thoroughly and so quietly that the only people who did not know about it were the ones who had chosen not to look. But Patricia had decided, sometime in the years when I was not paying close enough attention, that "your mother is not well" was a narrative she could keep alive indefinitely. That she could keep reciting an episode from 20 years ago as a current condition. That if she said it often enough, in that measured, concerned tone, people would simply accept it as fact. And for a long time, they had. I want to describe what the next 8 months of wedding planning actually felt like. Not the dramatic version, not the movie version, but the real version. Because in the real version, there is no single explosion. There is just a sustained, low-grade pressure that you begin to doubt is even real. Patricia suggested, twice, that the mother of the bride bouquet, a smaller arrangement traditionally carried by the groom's mother, or the bride's mother, should be ordered, in her color preference. When I gently redirected and said that my mother would be carrying it, Patricia went very still, and then said, "Oh, are we sure that is the plan we are going with?" Not hostile, just questioning, as if the plan were logistically uncertain rather than emotionally obvious. She asked my father to ask me whether my mother would be able to handle the emotion of the day. My father, to his very limited credit, relayed the question with at least enough self-awareness to look uncomfortable doing it. I told him that my mother had managed her emotions with more grace and more discipline than anyone I had ever met, and that the question itself was insulting. He nodded. He did not push back on Patricia. He never pushed back on Patricia. That is its own long story. Patricia also began, during this period, to refer to herself in conversations about the wedding as Lauren's mom. Not her stepmother, not her father's wife, her mom. She did this in conversations with the venue coordinator, with my future mother-in-law Carol, with people at her own book club, who then congratulated her on her daughter's upcoming wedding when they ran into my father at the Harris Teeter on Six Forks Road. Each of these things, in isolation, sounds small, correctable. The kind of thing you address with a direct conversation, and then it is resolved. But here is what I had learned over 30 years of watching Patricia operate. A direct conversation was exactly what she was designed to survive. She was extraordinary at direct conversations. She would express understanding. She would tear up slightly, She would say something about how she only ever wanted what was best for me, and you would leave the conversation, feeling vaguely guilty for having raised it. I know this because I had tried it before. I had tried it at 20, and at 23, and at 25, and every single time, the behavior stopped for approximately 3 to 4 weeks, and then resumed, slightly modified, slightly harder to name. This is what gaslighting actually looks like. Not a dramatic confrontation. Not an obvious lie. It is the steady, patient revision of reality by someone who is skilled enough to make you doubt the revision is even happening. By the 4th month of wedding planning, I was starting to feel it, that specific self-doubt. That quiet interior voice that says, am I overreacting? Is this actually as bad as I think? Maybe she just loves me and expresses it in ways that are overbearing, but ultimately harmless. Maybe I am the problem. And then I would have a Saturday breakfast with my mother, and I would watch Diane pour her coffee and ask me about Daniel's job and laugh at something I said, and be so completely demonstrably present, and the self-doubt would evaporate. Not because my mother said anything about Patricia, she rarely did, but because reality, when you are in the presence of someone who is genuinely anchored in it, has a way of reasserting itself. Be honest with me for a second. Have you ever been in a situation where someone was doing something to you, clearly, repeatedly, and yet you still found yourself questioning whether it was real? Because the person doing it was so calm, so reasonable sounding on the surface? I really want to know, because I think more people understand this than talk about it. Drop it in the comments. I read them. And if someone you know needs to hear the story, I think now would be a good time to send it to them. While I was navigating the wedding planning and the quiet campaign Patricia was running inside it, my mother was doing something I would not learn about in full until 4 months before the wedding. She was building a file. Not dramatically, not obsessively, methodically, the way a pediatric oncology nurse documents patient histories, with precision, with dates, with sources, with zero editorializing. Her attorney's name was Marcus Webb. He was a family law attorney based in Raleigh, on Glenwood Avenue, with 31 years of practice and a particular specialty in cases involving misrepresentation of parental identity and next of kin fraud. My mother had retained him 7 years earlier, not for any immediate legal action, but for consultation, for the slow work of understanding what options existed. Here is what they had been documenting. Over the course of those 7 years, Patricia had, on at least 14 documented occasions, introduced herself as Lauren's mother, in contexts where no correction was offered, and where the misrepresentation had material consequence. This included 2 conversations with school administrators during Lauren's college search, 3 interactions with medical office staff when Patricia had accompanied Lauren to appointments, 1 written communication to a homeowners association in the neighborhood where Lauren briefly lived after college, and, most significantly, a form submitted to Daniel Marsh's family life insurance provider during the engagement period, in which Patricia had listed herself when asked to provide information about the bride's immediate family as Lauren's mother. That last one is where it crossed from social behavior into legal territory. Marcus Webb had been watching for exactly this kind of documentation, not because it guaranteed a criminal case. The legal threshold for identity misrepresentation in a family context is genuinely complicated, but because it created a foundation for a civil action that could formally reinstate Diane Calloway's legal status as Lauren's next of kin in all relevant contexts. A reinstatement that had been quietly eroded over years by the cumulative weight of Patricia's narrative. The document they had prepared, a single-page court order from Wake County Family Court, had been signed by a judge 11 days before my wedding. I knew it was coming. My mother had told me, in broad strokes, what she and Marcus had been working on. She had not told me the specific plan for the wedding. She had told me to trust her. And I had. What I did not know, what she had decided completely on her own, with a composure that I still find almost unbelievable, was exactly how and when Marcus Webb would make his presence known. She had not told me, because she knew that if I knew, I would worry. And she did not want me worrying on my wedding day. She wanted me present. She wanted me happy. She wanted the day to be mine. That is who my mother is. Even in the middle of a 15-year fight for her own recognition, her first priority was making sure her daughter got to enjoy her wedding. 6 weeks before the wedding, my mother called me on a Tuesday evening while I was eating leftover pasta at my kitchen counter and going through vendor confirmations. She said, "I have a small request about the seating." I said, "Of course. What do you need?" She said, "I would like Marcus to attend the reception. I would like him seated at table 1. And I would like you to seat him there without explaining to anyone who he is." I put my fork down. I said, "Mom, what is table 1? And she said, very calmly, "It is the table closest to the front of the room. The one that the speakers will face when they give their toasts." I sat with that for a moment. And then I understood, not the full picture, but enough of the outline to feel it land somewhere deep and certain inside me. Patricia always gave toasts. This was a known fact about Patricia. At every family gathering of consequence in the past 15 years, Patricia had given a toast. She prepared them. She rehearsed them. She timed them. A wedding, her stepdaughter's wedding, the event she had been positioning herself for since the engagement announcement. There was no version of this day in which Patricia was not going to stand up and speak. My mother knew this. Of course she knew this. I added Marcus Webb to the seating chart under his full name, Marcus Webb. No title. No explanation. Just a name. At table 1, next to my great-aunt, Harriet and Daniel's college roommate from Chapel Hill. I did not tell Daniel the full plan, only that my mother had an attorney who would be present, and that there might be a moment during the reception that required his patience and his trust. Daniel looked at me for a long moment and then said, "Is this going to be okay?" And I said, "It is going to be a lot of things. Okay is one of them." He squeezed my hand and went back to his crossword puzzle. I love that man. In the final 2 weeks before the wedding, Patricia operated at a frequency I can only describe as the social equivalent of a car alarm. She was everywhere. She was in every group text. She was at the rehearsal dinner 30 minutes early, rearranging the centerpieces, because she felt the candles were slightly off-center. She told the venue coordinator, unprompted, that she was the mother of the bride, so please feel free to come to me with any logistical questions. The venue coordinator, a calm woman named Tanya, who had clearly navigated difficult family dynamics before, smiled and wrote something in her clipboard notebook, and did not ask Patricia a single logistical question for the remainder of the event. My mother arrived at the rehearsal dinner 45 minutes after it started. She had been at work. She changed in her car in the parking lot. I know this because she told me, laughing quietly about it, and she walked in with her braid over her left shoulder and a cardigan I had given her 2 Christmases ago, and she sat down next to Daniel's mother, Carol, and within 11 minutes, they were deep in a conversation about perennial gardens that lasted. The rest of the dinner, Patricia noticed my mother arrive. I watched her notice. There was a pause in whatever Patricia had been saying to my father's cousin. A slight repositioning, a recalibration, like a compass needle making a small involuntary correction. She did not approach my mother that evening. My mother did not approach her. 2 women, 2 completely different relationships to the same event, and only one of them knew what was already in motion. The morning of my wedding, I woke up at 6:15 in a small room at the farmhouse venue that smelled like cedar and old wood and the wildflower arrangement my mother had brought the night before and left on the windowsill. My bridesmaids were asleep on the pullout in the next room. The September light was coming in thin and gold and perfect. My mother arrived at 7. She knocked on the door softly, the way she always has. 3 small knocks, then a pause, the exact same pattern she used when I was 8 years old, and she was checking if I was awake for school. She came in with 2 coffees in paper cups from the small bakery in Pittsboro, and a paper bag with 2 blueberry scones. We sat on the edge of the bed and drank our coffee while the light changed outside the window. And we talked about everything except what was going to happen later. We talked about the garden she was planning for next spring. We talked about a book she was reading. We talked about Daniel. And she said again what she had said when she first met him. I see where you get it from. And this time, I did not cry. I just took her hand. At some point she said, very quietly, Marcus will be seated by 9:30. He knows what to do. You just get married, sweetheart. That is the only thing you need to do today. I nodded. I believed her. And then my bridesmaids appeared in the doorway, demanding coffee, and the morning shifted into the beautiful, chaotic normalcy of a wedding morning. And for a few hours, everything was just good. Simple and good. I want to pause right here for a second. Because what is about to happen, I have told this story to people in person, and there is always a moment when they go completely quiet. When they stop checking their phones. When they just wait. If you are still with me, you already know this story has something coming. And I promise you, it is worth staying for. But I also want to say, stories like this happen more often than we talk about. That is why I share them. If this one is hitting something real for you, stick around. There is more here. The ceremony began at 4 o'clock. The field behind the farmhouse was exactly what I had imagined. The late September light doing that specific thing it does in North Carolina, where it turns everything amber and slightly unreal, like a memory of itself. 120 guests. White wooden chairs arranged in 2 sections on the grass. A string quartet playing something quiet and lovely. Daniel at the end of the aisle, in a dark charcoal suit, looking at me in a way that I will not try to put into words, because there are no words that do not underperform the actual thing. My father walked me down the aisle. This had been a negotiation, brief and civil, but a negotiation. Patricia had suggested, in a separate conversation with my father that he had then relayed to me, that perhaps both parents should walk Lauren down, meaning herself and my father, together. When I heard this, I sat with the audacity of it for a long, quiet moment. My father walked me down the aisle alone. My mother sat in the front row on the left side. She was wearing a deep rose dress, and her braid over her left shoulder, and she was holding a small clutch in her lap, and her eyes were bright in the way that people's eyes get when they are doing everything in their power not to cry. Patricia sat 3 rows back on the right side, in a silver gray dress that was, I will say this plainly, extremely appropriate and well chosen. She had taste. I have never disputed that. She sat next to my father's brother and his wife, and she was composed and present, and smiled at me as I passed, and it was a completely normal smile. Nothing about her expression suggested that she had any idea that 14 feet behind her, and 6 rows to the left, a man in a navy blue suit had just taken his seat at a small, reserved table near the back, and placed a leather portfolio carefully on the chair beside him. Marcus Webb had arrived. The ceremony lasted 32 minutes. I know this because I was paying attention to almost everything that afternoon, with a strange, heightened clarity. The kind of clarity that I think happens when you are simultaneously completely in a moment, and aware that the moment is important. Daniel and I had written our own vows. His made me laugh. Mine made him cry, which he will dispute if you ask him. When the officiant said, "You may kiss your spouse," the field erupted. Not politely, genuinely erupted. 120 people who had been holding something tender, finally letting it go. And somewhere in the back of that field, Marcus Webb closed his portfolio, stood to applaud with everyone else, and then walked quietly toward the barn for the reception. He had a seat waiting for him. Table 1. Right side, next to my great-aunt Harriet, who would later describe him as a lovely man, very quietly spoken, seemed to know something the rest of us did not. She was not wrong. The barn at the Pittsboro farmhouse held 120 people, without feeling crowded. Long communal tables ran the length of the room, covered in cream linen, with low centerpieces of dried wheat and white ranunculus that Rosa, my florist, the one I chose, not. Patricia's pre-approved contact had assembled with a kind of effortless specificity that made the whole room feel intentional. String lights ran the ceiling beams. There was a small stage at the far end where the band was setting up, and at the front of the room, closest to the stage and to the dance floor, were the round tables. The round tables were for immediate family. Table 1 was the closest. I saw Marcus Webb take his seat approximately 40 minutes into the cocktail hour. He was exactly as my mother had described him. Measured, navy suit, leather portfolio. He looked like what he was. A man who had been in a great many rooms where important things were about to happen, and had learned to occupy those rooms without drawing attention to himself. He accepted a glass of water from a passing server. He introduced himself to my great-aunt Harriet. He did not check his phone. Patricia had not noticed him. Why would she? He was one name on a seating chart of 120. He had no identifier, no title, no flag. He was just a man at a table, making quiet conversation about Harriet's begonia garden. My mother arrived at the reception and was seated at table 1 as well, on the opposite side, next to Daniel's parents, Jim and Carol. I watched Carol immediately reach across and squeeze my mother's hand, the warm, uncomplicated gesture of one mother to another. My mother smiled, the specific smile she has when something catches her off guard in a good way. A real smile, not performed, not strategic. Patricia was at table 3, center of the room, which was, I will say, an extremely good table with excellent sightlines to the stage and the dance floor. I had made sure of that. I am not cruel. The dinner was beautiful. The band played. Daniel and I did our first dance to a song we had argued about for 2 weeks, and ultimately chose together, and it was exactly right. His parents danced. My mother danced with Daniel's college roommate, who was a terrible dancer, and she was patient and gracious about it, and laughed in that full-body way of hers that made half the room turn and smile, without even knowing why. I was happy. Genuinely, presently, without reservation happy. And I knew it was coming. I knew what was waiting inside the happiness, like a splinter inside a clean surface. And I had made my peace with it. I had decided, months ago, that I was not going to spend my wedding day braced. I was going to be present until the moment arrived. And then, I was going to trust my mother. The toasts were scheduled for 8:15. The best man went first. Daniel's oldest friend, a man named Greg, who had known him since they were 9 years old in Charlotte, and who delivered a toast that was funny and sincere and exactly 10 minutes long, which is the correct length for a best man toast. My maid of honor went second. My friend Rachel, who had known me since our freshman year at UNC Greensboro, who referenced 3 specific memories that made me laugh, and one that made me cry, and sat down to a standing ovation from the table nearest the band. Then the band leader, following the reception timeline I had submitted, announced that the floor was open for anyone else who wished to offer a toast. Patricia stood up. I want to be precise about this moment. She did not leap up. She did not rush. She rose with the deliberate composure of someone who had been waiting for this exact moment and had rehearsed the rising of it. She had a champagne flute in her right hand. She had a folded note card in her left. She had the silver gray dress and the blown-out hair and the smile she had practiced until it looked natural. The room quieted. 120 people turned toward her. She said, "For those of you who do not know me, my name is Patricia. I am Lauren's mother." Not stepmother, not Patricia, Lauren's father's wife, or even Patricia, who has been in Lauren's life for many years. Not any construction that acknowledged complexity or history or the actual architecture of the relationship. Her mother. She continued. Her voice was warm and modulated, and everything she said was technically a feeling rather than a verifiable claim, which was, I had come to understand, her greatest skill. She talked about watching Lauren grow. She talked about being part of this incredible journey. She talked about Daniel with genuine-sounding enthusiasm, citing 2 specific details about him that she had gotten from conversations with my father, deployed now as evidence of closeness. And then she said it. The sentence that I had known, in some cellular way, was always going to come. The sentence that the entire 15 years had been building toward, placed now at its most public and most unassailable moment. She said, "Lauren, I want you to know, in front of everyone you love, that being your real mother has been the greatest privilege of my life." Real mother. 2 words. In front of 120 people. On a microphone, while my actual mother, Diane Calloway, pediatric oncology nurse, lavender soap, vanilla pancakes, 3-knock pattern, full body laugh, was seated 14 feet away. I felt Daniel's hand find mine under the table. He did not look at me. He just found my hand and held it. I did not look at my mother. I had promised myself I would not look at her in that moment, because I did not trust what I would do if I saw her face. The room was very quiet. Not the good quiet of a toast landing well. A different kind of quiet. The kind that happens when a room full of people receives information and does not know yet what to do with it. Some of the guests knew our family history. Some did not. The ones who did not were smiling politely. The ones who did were very still. Patricia raised her glass, and Marcus Webb stood up. He did not rush. That is the detail I come back to most often when I replay this moment. He did not leap to his feet. He did not interrupt. He waited until Patricia had finished her sentence. He waited until she raised her glass, and then, in the half-second of held breath before the room responded, he stood. He was not a dramatic-looking man. He was 61 years old, medium height, silver-haired, with a kind of face that communicates competence without effort. He stood at table 1, and he said, in a voice that was completely conversational and carried the room without a microphone, "I apologize for the interruption. My name is Marcus Webb. I am an attorney licensed in the state of North Carolina, and I am here this evening as legal counsel for Diane Calloway, Lauren's mother." The room did not react immediately. There is a processing delay that happens when something genuinely unexpected occurs in a social setting. For approximately 3 seconds, the barn was absolutely, perfectly silent. Then Patricia said, from across the room, in a voice that had lost precisely none of its composure, "I am sorry. Who are you?" And Marcus said, pleasantly, "Marcus Webb. As I mentioned, I have a document I would like to read into the record of this gathering, if the bride and groom are willing to permit it." He looked at me. I nodded once. He opened the leather portfolio. He removed a single page, one page, the court order from Wake County Family Court, and he held it with both hands the way you hold something that has weight beyond its physical dimensions. And he read it. He read it in full. It was not long. It was precise and legal in its language, and entirely clear in its meaning. A court order formally recognizing Diane Marie Calloway as Lauren Elizabeth Calloway's legal next of kin, reinstating all rights and designations that had been materially misrepresented in documented interactions over the preceding 7 years, and formally noting for the court. Record that any representation of another individual as Lauren Calloway's parent without qualification or correction constituted a civil misrepresentation with legal consequence. He read every word. He read the date, 11 days prior. He read the judge's name. He read the case number. And then he folded the document carefully, returned it to the portfolio, and said, "Thank you for your time. Congratulations to the bride and groom." And he sat down. 120 people. Complete silence. And then Daniel's mother, Carol, sweet, uncomplicated, North Carolina born and raised Carol Marsh, who had spent the dinner sitting next to my mother and learning about perennial gardens, began to applaud. It started with Carol, and it spread. I looked at Patricia. "I want to be honest about what I saw, because I think it matters for the full truth of the story." She did not collapse. She did not make a scene. She stood with her champagne flute still raised for one additional moment. The moment after Marcus sat down and before the applause started, and the expression on her face was something I had never seen on her in 30 years of knowing her. It was not humiliation, exactly. It was recognition. The specific look of someone who has operated for a very long time on the assumption that their construction of reality is permanent, suddenly understanding that it is not, that it was never as permanent as they believed. She lowered her glass. She sat down. She did not speak again for the rest of the evening. My father sat next to her and stared at the tablecloth. He looked, for the first time in a very long time, like a man who understood exactly what he had allowed to happen, and had no defense against his own understanding of it. I looked at my mother. Diane Calloway was sitting very straight in her chair at table 1. Her hands were folded in her lap. She was not crying. She was not triumphant in any visible, outward way. She looked the way she always looks when something difficult has resolved correctly, composed, and quietly, privately glad. She caught my eye across the room, and she gave me the smallest possible nod. That nod, I will take that with me for the rest of my life. The band started playing again within 4 minutes, because a good band understands their primary function, which is to give a room something to do with its body when its mind is overloaded. People began to move. Conversations resumed, cautiously at first, and then normally. The night continued. Daniel leaned over to me and said, quietly, "You okay?" I thought about it honestly for a moment, and then I said, "Yes, I genuinely am." He kissed the side of my head. We went and danced. Patricia and my father left the reception early. Not dramatically. They said their goodbyes to a few people and slipped out around 9:30. I did not speak to Patricia that evening. I did not feel I needed to. Everything that needed to be said had already been said, by someone far more qualified to say it. In the weeks following the wedding, my father called me twice. The first call was short and uncomfortable. He said he thought the whole thing had been unnecessary and hurtful, and that he hoped I understood what I had put Patricia through. I told him that I understood the evening had been difficult for Patricia, and that I hoped he understood what had been put through for the preceding 15 years. He did not have a response to that. We hung up and did not speak for 6 weeks. The second call was different. It was a Tuesday evening, about 6 weeks after the wedding. He called later than he usually does, around 9:30, and his voice had a quality I had not heard from him in a long time. Something stripped of its usual protective coating. He said, "I owe your mother an apology." I said, "Yes." "You do," he said. "I do not know if she will accept it." I said, "That is her decision to make, Dad, not ours." He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said something that surprised me. He said, "She was always the better one, I knew that. I think that is part of why I did what I did." He was not asking for absolution. He was not framing it as an excuse. He was just naming it. Finally, 22 years later, naming the thing he had done and the ugliness underneath the reason. I did not comfort him. I did not tell him it was okay. But I stayed on the phone. That felt like enough for that night. As for the legal matter, Marcus Webb filed the additional documentation in the weeks following the wedding, formalizing the court record. There was no criminal charge. The civil order stood. Patricia did not contest it. My understanding is that she consulted her own attorney, who told her something that landed hard enough, that contesting was not the direction she pursued. I do not know the full details of what happened between Patricia and my father in the months after the wedding. That is not my story to tell. I know that they are still married. I know that my father calls me every 2 or 3 weeks now, and that our conversations are quieter and more honest than they have been since I was a child. I know that Patricia has not contacted me directly. I have not sought contact with her. I hold no dramatic victory in this. That is the thing about real life versus the story version. The resolution does not arrive as a clean, satisfying conclusion. It arrives as a new arrangement, a different set of things to navigate. I want to ask you something sincerely. Would you have done this differently? If it had been your wedding, your mother, 15 years of quiet erasure, would you have found another way? Or would you have let that room hear the truth? I genuinely want to know what you think. Leave it in the comments, because I have asked myself that question more times than I can count, and I still do not have a clean answer. I want to tell you what my mother said to me on the morning after the wedding, because this is the part that I think matters most, and I would be doing the whole story a disservice if I left it out. We were at the small kitchen table in the farmhouse, which Daniel and I had rented for the full weekend. It was Sunday morning. Everyone else was asleep, or at the continental breakfast the venue put out in the main building. My mother and I were at that kitchen table with the same paper cups from the same Pittsboro bakery as the morning before, and the light through the window was that flat, bright. Sunday kind that makes everything feel a little more honest than it does the rest of the week. I said, "Was it enough? What happened last night, was it what you needed it to be?" She thought about that for a long moment. She turned the paper cup in her hands the way she does when she is being genuinely careful with a question, rather than just answering it. And then she said, "I did not do it because I needed it. I did it because you deserved to be married in a room where the true story was on record." That is different. I thought about that distinction for a long time afterward. The difference between doing something because you need it and doing something because someone you love deserves it. Because I think that distinction says everything about who Diane Calloway actually is. She never did this for revenge. I want to be clear about that, because the word revenge makes it sound clean and satisfying, like a door closing. This was not that. She did it because for 15 years a false story had been told about her in rooms she was not in. About her stability, about her capability, about her relationship with her own daughter, and she had reached a point, methodically, legally, calmly, where she could put the true story in the room instead. That is not revenge. That is correction. And she waited for my wedding to do it, because she understood that a wedding is a public declaration, that it is a room full of people who are paying attention, who will remember, who will carry what happened in that room out into the world with them. She did not want a private conversation. She had had private conversations for 22 years, and private conversations had not worked. She wanted a public record. She got one. I have been married to Daniel Marsh for 11 months now. We live in a house in Pittsboro, North Carolina, a small yellow house on a street with old oak trees that drop their leaves all at once in November, which I find unreasonably satisfying. We are happy in the ordinary, specific, unglamorous way that real happiness works. My mother comes for dinner most Sunday evenings. She always brings something from her garden, whatever is in season. In October it was tomatoes. In January it was herbs, dried and bundled with kitchen twine. She and Daniel have developed their own friendship independent of me, which is something I watch with a feeling I do not have a precise word for. Something between gratitude and relief, and a particular kind of rightness. I also carry things that did not resolve. I carry the years I spent choosing Patricia's comfort over my mother's recognition. The soccer game. The graduation photos, the times I smiled when assumptions were made and said nothing. I was a child for some of those moments and a teenager for others and then a young adult for the rest, and none of those categories fully excuses the weight of them. But they contextualize it. I carry the specific shape of my father's voice on that Tuesday phone call, the stripped, late-night quality of it, because it contained something I had waited a very long time to hear, and it arrived 22 years after the damage was done, which is both better than never and not nearly soon enough. I carry the image of Patricia's face in that moment, the lowering of the glass, not with satisfaction. I carry it because it is a reminder that people who operate from entitlement rarely anticipate accountability, and that the gap between those two things, the entitlement and the accountability, is where the real story lives. And I carry my mother. I carry her with me the way you carry something that shaped you, not as a wound and not as a trophy, but as a fact of your architecture. The lavender soap, the 3-knock pattern, the full body laugh, the way she turned the paper cup in her hands when she was being careful with a question. She was always the truest thing in the story. She just had to wait for the room to be ready to hear it. If you have stayed with me through this whole story, thank you. Genuinely. I know it is a long one. But some things cannot be told in 5 minutes, and I think you knew that when you stayed. If someone in your life is being quietly written out of their own story, if you have watched someone you love get replaced, renamed, or revised by someone with more presence and less right, I hope this gave you something. I hope it gave you the language for it, or the patience for it, or at minimum the knowledge that you are not the only one who has sat in that particular kind of silence. Stories like this one are why I keep sharing. If this reached you, you might want to stick around, and if you know someone who needs to hear it, I think you already know what to do. My wedding was on the last Saturday of September. The field went gold in the late afternoon light. Daniel cried at the vows. The band played past 11, and somewhere between the first dance and the final toast, in a barn in Pittsboro, North Carolina, in front of 120 people who will not forget what they witnessed. The true story of my family was read into the public record by a man in a navy suit at table 1, right where my mother placed him. She always was the smartest person in the room. We just did not always make room for her to show it.